The silence of Blackwood Manor was not empty, it was heavy, like a lungful of water just before drowning. It was a silence that had weight and texture, draped over the Victorian furniture and the velvet drapes like a fine, suffocating dust. Amanda sat by the bay window of the drawing room, watching the rain lash against the glass. Outside, the Appalachian twilight was bleeding into a bruised purple, the dense woods surrounding the estate closing in as if to strangle the house. It had been 3 months. 3 months since she had married William Blackwood. 3 months since she had been whisked away from her cramped apartment in the city to this sprawling, isolationist kingdom of old money and older secrets. She should have been happy. She told herself this every morning when she woke up in sheets of Egyptian cotton. She was the lady of the manor, the chosen one, the fresh blood in a lineage that seemed to be fading into sepia. "You look pensive, my dear." The voice floated through the room, light and sweet as spun sugar. Amanda turned to see Elizabeth standing in the archway. Her mother-in-law, the matriarch, the woman who defied time. Elizabeth was 60, according to the family Bible, but she looked no older than 35. Her skin was a miracle of porcelain perfection, taut and luminous, without a single line to betray the years. Her hair was a cascade of obsidian silk, untouched by gray, framing a face that was terrifyingly symmetrical. There was a mystical allure to Elizabeth, a gravitational pull that demanded adoration. When she smiled, the room seemed to brighten. When she frowned, the temperature dropped. "Just watching the storm, Elizabeth," Amanda said, forcing a smile. "It's beautiful in a way." "It's cleansing," Elizabeth corrected gently, gliding into the room. She didn't walk, she drifted. She placed a hand on Amanda's shoulder. Her touch was warm, too warm. A suffocating warmth that seemed to radiate from her bones, bypassing the skin and heating the blood directly. "Tonight is a special night, Amanda. 3 months. The first trimester of your new life." "I can't believe you remember the date," Amanda said, leaning into the touch despite the vague instinct to pull away. "I remember everything that enters this house," Elizabeth whispered. "And tonight I have prepared the offering. The tradition, the Friday night feast. Since Amanda had arrived, every Friday was sacrosanct. The maids were dismissed early. The heavy oak doors of the root cellar and the main kitchen were locked from the inside. Elizabeth would disappear into the culinary bowels of the house for hours, emerging only when the sun had fully set. And then the aroma would begin. It started as a whisper under the door frames, a scent of burning hickory and applewood. Then came the spices, sage, thyme, and something sweeter, heavier, like vanilla pods crushed in dirt. Finally, the smell of the meat. God, that smell! It was currently wafting up the grand staircase, snaking its way into the drawing room. It was an olfactory assault of nauseating sweetness mixed with a savory richness that triggered a primal, violent hunger in the pit of Amanda's stomach. It smelled like the best meal she had ever imagined, yet beneath it lay a cloying heaviness, a greasy film that coated the back of her throat and made her want to gag. It was the scent of heaven, but it felt like it was rising from a vent in hell. "Come," Elizabeth said, her eyes gleaming with a fervor that bordered on mania. "The boys are waiting." They walked to the dining room. The long mahogany table was set with silver candelabras, the flames flickering wildly despite the lack of a draught. William, Amanda's husband, was already seated. He looked small in the high-backed chair. William was a handsome man, but he carried himself like a dog that had been kicked too many times. His eyes were perpetually downcast, his shoulders hunched. He loved Amanda. She felt that in the desperate way he held her at night, but in this house, in the presence of his mother, he was a ghost. At the far end sat his older brothers, Tony and Alex. If William was a ghost, they were gargoyles, massive, silent men with broad shoulders and eyes that seemed devoid of any spark. They didn't speak. They didn't look at Amanda. They stared at the empty plates before them with a robotic intensity, their hands folded on the tablecloth, knuckles white. "Sit, my darling," Elizabeth commanded softly. Amanda sat next to William. She reached for his hand under the table. His palm was clammy, cold as ice. He squeezed her fingers. Not in affection, she realized with a start, but in warning. Or was it fear? Elizabeth stood at the head of the table. She did not sit. She served. She brought out the platter. It was silver, large enough to hold a suckling pig, but instead, it held mounds of skewers. The meat was dark, glazed in a sauce that shimmered like black lacquer under the candlelight. The steam rising from it carried that mystical allure, a pheromone cloud that made Amanda's mouth water so hard it hurt her jaw. "Tonight we celebrate unity," Elizabeth announced, her voice trembling with emotion. "To keep the family whole. To keep the circle unbroken." "To the circle!" Tony and Alex droned in unison. Their voices were flat, grinding like gravel. William murmured something inaudible, his eyes squeezed shut for a fleeting second. Elizabeth moved around the table, placing the skewers onto their plates with tongs. The sound of the meat hitting the china was wet and heavy. Slap! 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 When she reached Amanda, she didn't just drop the meat. She leaned in close, the scent of her perfume, lilac and formaldehyde, mixing with the barbecue smoke. "For you, the choicest cut," Elizabeth whispered, "because you are the newest vessel of our happiness." She placed a skewer on Amanda's plate. The meat looked different from the others. It was more tender, the grain finer, the glaze a deeper crimson. "Eat," Elizabeth commanded. She returned to her seat and watched. She didn't eat. She never ate on Fridays. She only watched them, her eyes tracing the movement of the forks, her lips parted in a look of vicarious ecstasy. Amanda picked up her fork. The hunger was unbearable now. Her logic, her unease, the oppressive atmosphere, all of it was overridden by the biological imperative to consume the smelling thing. She sliced a piece of the meat. It parted effortlessly, no knife needed. It was impossibly tender. She lifted the fork to her lips. The aroma filled her sinuses, drowning out the smell of the rain, the old wood, the fear. She put the meat in her mouth. The flavor exploded. It was divine, smoky, sweet, savory, with a depth of umami she had never experienced. It melted on her tongue like butter. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. And then the weeping started. It wasn't a sound. It was a sensation. As Amanda chewed, a sudden, crushing wave of unexplained grief slammed into her chest. It was a physical blow. Her throat constricted. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and fast, blurring her vision. It felt as if the meat itself was crying. She wasn't just tasting spices and glaze. She was tasting sorrow. She was tasting a desperate plea for help. She was tasting the coldness of a lonely room and the sharp sting of betrayal. The flavor was infused with a profound, screaming melancholy. Amanda dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against the china. "Is something wrong, dear?" Elizabeth asked. The sweetness in her voice was now razor-sharp. Amanda gasped, bringing a napkin to her mouth. She swallowed the meat because she couldn't bring herself to spit it out. It felt sacrilegious, like spitting out a communion wafer. The meat slid down her throat, leaving a trail of icy dread in her esophagus. I don't know," Amanda stammered, wiping the tears from her cheeks. "I just felt sad." Suddenly, William let out a small, choked sound, like a sob caught in a vice. He was chewing frantically, his eyes wide and terrified, staring at his plate as if it were a coffin. Elizabeth smiled. It was a beatific, terrifying smile. She reached across the table and patted Amanda's hand. "That is the secret ingredient, Amanda," Elizabeth cooed, her eyes locking onto Amanda's with a hypnotic intensity. "Love. Pure, sacrificial love. Sometimes love is so deep it feels like pain. It feels like loss. But it nourishes us. It keeps us young." She looked at her own hands, turning them over in the candlelight. They were smooth, unblemished, the hands of a maiden. "It keeps us together," Elizabeth whispered. Amanda looked down at her plate. The remaining meat on the skewer seemed to pulse faintly in the candlelight. The grease pooling around it looked too much like dark, coagulated blood. She felt a layer of slime coating her soul, a spiritual contamination she knew she would never be able to scrub off. From across the table, Tony stopped chewing. He looked at Amanda. For the first time, he blinked. His expression was not one of hunger, but of a grim, hollow warning. "Eat up, Amanda," Elizabeth said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming a command that vibrated in the floorboards. "Don't be ungrateful. We don't waste anything in this house, especially not family." Outside, thunder cracked, shaking the foundations of Blackwood Manor. But inside, the silence returned, heavy, sweet, and reeking of a delicious, abominable death. The aftertaste of the Friday feast was a greasy, cloying film that coated the roof of Amanda's mouth, refusing to be washed away by water or wine. It was 2 a.m., and the silence in Blackwood Manor was absolute, a deafening silence that pressed against the eardrums, louder than any scream. Beside her, William slept with the stillness of a corpse. His breathing was shallow, his hands folded across his chest in that terrifyingly rigid posture he adopted even in slumber. He had taken the herbal tonic Elizabeth prepared for him after dinner, a thick, dark liquid that smelled of valerian and something metallic. Now, he was lost to the world, drifting in a chemically induced void where his mother's shadow couldn't reach him. Amanda could not sleep. Her stomach churned, not with nausea, but with a strange, undulating restlessness, as if the meat she had consumed was moving, seeking a way out. The fading traces of the weeping sensation she had felt at dinner still lingered in her chest, a phantom sorrow that wasn't hers. Driven by an insomnia that felt like a summons, Amanda slipped out of bed. The floorboards of the hallway were cold, biting into the soles of her feet with a sterile coldness that seeped into her bones. She didn't know where she was going until she found herself standing in the West Wing. This part of the house was technically not forbidden, but it was shunned. It was where Alex and Joanna had lived before. The official story, the one Elizabeth recited with a pitying shake of her head, was that Joanna had run off with a mechanic from the town below, leaving poor Alex heartbroken. But Amanda had met Alex. Alex didn't have a heart to break. He was a monolith of stone and silence. Amanda stood before the door at the end of the hall. Joanna's room. The brass knob was freezing. She turned it, half expecting it to be locked, but it swung open on well-oiled hinges. The air inside hit her like a physical blow. It was frigid, smelling of lemon polish and bleach, an antiseptic odor that scrubbed the senses raw. Amanda stepped inside and raised her candlelight. What she saw made her skin crawl. It was a museum, a mausoleum. The room was terrifyingly pristine. In a house this old, nestled in the damp woods, dust was an inevitability. It gathered in corners, settled on drapes, danced in the light. But here, there was nothing. The surfaces of the vanity table gleamed with a maniacal shine. The bed was made with military precision, the sheets pulled so tight a quarter would bounce off them. The curtains hung in stiff, perfect pleats. It was a room that was not allowed to age. It was a room that was not allowed to forget. Amanda walked to the vanity. Joanna's silver hairbrush was there, aligned perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. A bottle of perfume sat next to it. Amanda picked it up. It was full. "She ran away," Amanda whispered to the empty room, testing the lie against the sterile coldness of the atmosphere. "She ran away with a lover, but she left her favorite perfume. She left her wedding ring." She remembered the ring she had seen Alex wearing on a chain around his neck once, before Elizabeth had told him to hide it. This wasn't the room of a woman who had fled. This was the room of a woman who had been erased. The absence of clutter, the absence of dust, it spoke of an obsessive caretaker. Someone came in here every day. Someone scrubbed the floorboards on their hands and knees. Someone ensured that no fading traces of Joanna's true fate remained to stain the wood. "You shouldn't be in here." The voice was a jagged whisper. Amanda spun around, nearly dropping her candle. William stood in the doorway. He looked like a frightened child in his silk pajamas, his eyes wide and glassy, fighting the sedative fog. He didn't look angry. He looked terrified. "William," Amanda breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. I couldn't sleep." "Mother doesn't like the dust to settle," William murmured, stepping into the room. He didn't look at Amanda. He looked at the floor, at the walls, his eyes darting frantically as if checking for invisible cracks. "She says dust is sin." She says we have to keep it clean for when Joanna comes back. You think she's coming back? Amanda asked, stepping closer to her husband. William let out a high, hysterical giggle that died instantly in his throat. No, she's not coming back. Nobody comes back from where she went. Where did she go, William? Amanda grabbed his shoulders. Under the silk, his body was trembling violently. Tell me. Everyone says she ran away. But you look like you're mourning her. William's eyes snapped to hers. For a second, the fog cleared, and Amanda saw a deep, bottomless well of loss and horror. She didn't run, William whispered, his voice barely audible over the drumming of the rain outside. She was harvested. She was too loud, too proud. She wouldn't bend to Mother. So Mother made her part of the house. What does that mean? Amanda shook him. William! He flinched, pulling away from her grasp. The mask of submission slammed back into place. Nothing. I'm talking nonsense. The medicine, it makes me dream. Come back to bed, Amanda. Please. If she finds us here. He looked at the ceiling, as if Elizabeth could see through the floorboards. She hears the dust falling. William turned and fled the room, his bare feet slapping softly against the wood, a coward retreating into the safety of his denial. Amanda stood alone in the center of the room, shivering. She felt a profound loneliness, a sense of loss that echoed the grief she had tasted in the meat. She turned to leave, her eyes sweeping the floor one last time. The candlelight caught a flaw. In the center of the room, on the perfectly polished oak floorboards, something broke the symmetry. It was a single hair. Amanda frowned. She knelt. In a room scrubbed clean enough to perform surgery in, a stray hair was an impossibility. It was long, jet black, and thick, much coarser than her own hair, and darker than anyone's in the family except the woman in the portraits, except Joanna. Amanda reached out to pick it up, intending to examine it. Her fingers brushed the strand. She gasped and jerked her hand back. It was hot. The hair wasn't just lying on the floor. It felt searing hot to the touch, vibrating with a feverish intensity. It felt like touching a live wire or skin that had been baking in the sun. Amanda swallowed her fear and reached out again. She pinched the end of the hair and pulled. It didn't move. She pulled harder. The hair stretched slightly, taut as a violin string, but the other end didn't lift from the floor. Amanda brought the candle closer, lowering her face until her nose was inches from the wood. The hair wasn't resting on the floorboard. It was growing out of it. It emerged from the microscopic grain of the oak wood, rooted deep within the timber of the house itself. Around the follicle, the wood was slightly charred, as if the hair was burning its way through the structure from below. And then, the smell hit her. It wasn't the smell of lemon polish anymore. Rising from that single, impossible strand of hair was a faint, mystical aroma. It was the smell of white sage, dry earth, and ancient copal incense, the scent of a temple, or a tomb, hidden deep within a jungle she had never visited. It was the smell of the sister-in-law who was supposed to be in California. She's here, Amanda whispered, the realization settling over her with a sterile coldness that froze her blood. She didn't leave. She's underneath. The floorboard vibrated beneath her fingertips, a low, rhythmic thrumming. Thump-thump, thump-thump. It was the heartbeat of the house. Or perhaps the heartbeat of the thing the house had swallowed. Amanda scrambled backward, scrambling on her hands and heels until she hit the doorframe. She blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, but even in the dark, she could feel the heat radiating from that single, rooted hair, a tiny beacon of defiance in a room designed to erase existence. Joanna was not gone. She was simply planted. Morning in Blackwood Manor did not break. It bruised. The sun struggled to penetrate the heavy velvet curtains, casting long, sickly shadows across the Persian rugs. The air in the hallways was frigid, a bone-chilling cold that had nothing to do with the thermostat and everything to do with the entities that walked the corridors. Amanda stood at the top of the grand staircase, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Below, in the foyer, the twins were waiting. Tony and Alex, William's older brothers. They stood on either side of the front door like gargoyles hewn from granite. They were identical in their imposing stature, broad shoulders, thick necks, hands the size of shovels, but it was their stillness that was unnatural. They didn't shift their weight. They didn't check their watches. They didn't speak. They simply existed in a state of suspended animation, a rigid tableau of obedience waiting for a command that only they could hear. Amanda descended the stairs, her hand trailing along the banister. The wood felt damp. "Good morning," she said, her voice sounding thin and fragile in the cavernous space. The response was mechanical. Two heads turned in perfect unison. Two pairs of eyes locked onto her. "Morning," Alex grunted. "Morning," Tony echoed a millisecond later. The sound was identical, flat, devoid of inflection, stripping the greeting of any warmth. It was the sound of a tape recorder clicking on and off. Their eyes, dark and deep-set, held an unblinking gaze that bored right through her. There was no curiosity in them, no lust, no brotherly affection. There was only a void, a terrifying vacancy where a human soul should have been flickering. They were not men, they were hollow shells. Amanda walked past them toward the dining room, fighting the urge to run. She could feel their eyes tracking her, swiveling in their sockets with the precision of surveillance cameras. Breakfast was a silent affair. William poked at his scrambled eggs, his face pale and drawn from the night before. Elizabeth sat at the head of the table, sipping tea with her pinky extended, radiating that sickening, porcelain perfection. But Amanda couldn't take her eyes off the twins. They ate with a synchronized, jerky rhythm that was mesmerizing in its horror. Fork up, mouth open, insert, chew 3 times, swallow, fork down. It was an industrial process, fueling the engines. "Tony, Alex," Elizabeth cooed, setting down her teacup. "The garden wall needs tending today. The ivy is getting aggressive." "Yes, Mother," they chorused. The words fell from their lips like stones dropped into a well. They stood up simultaneously, their chairs scraping against the floorboards in a harsh, singular shriek. They turned. They marched out. They moved like marionettes whose strings were being pulled by a master puppeteer located somewhere in Elizabeth's chest. Amanda watched them go, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She realized then that this house wasn't filled with a family. It was filled with memories forced to play house. Tony and Alex were just props, terrifyingly realistic mannequins kept around to maintain the illusion of a bustling dynasty. Later that afternoon, the house settled into its usual oppressive quiet. William had retreated to the library to work, which Amanda knew meant drinking scotch and staring at the wall. Elizabeth had gone into town for her charity meetings. Amanda found herself wandering the ground floor, drawn inevitably toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen, toward the root cellar. She turned the corner into the mudroom and stopped dead. They were there. Tony and Alex. They weren't in the garden. They weren't fixing the wall. They were standing guard. The heavy oak door to the root cellar was closed and locked, as always. But the twins stood on either side of it, their backs pressed against the wall, their arms crossed over their massive chests. They were staring straight ahead at the opposite wall, unmoving. They looked like the terracotta warriors she had seen in history books, clay soldiers created to serve an emperor in the afterlife. Except their emperor was very much alive, and she grilled skewers on Friday nights. "I thought you were fixing the wall," Amanda said, her voice trembling slightly. They didn't startle. They didn't blink. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Tony turned his head. The movement was stiff, accompanied by the faint sound of joints popping, like dry twigs snapping in a winter forest. "Wall is done," Tony said. "Mother likes us here," Alex added, his eyes still fixed on the empty space in front of him. "Why?" Amanda stepped closer. The bone-chilling cold radiating off them was intense here. It smelled of wet earth and copper. "Why does she need guards for a pantry? What is she afraid will get out?" "Not get out," Tony droned. "Get in." "Who?" "Curiosity," Alex said. The words sounded foreign in his mouth, clumsy and thick. Amanda shivered. "You're her sons. Don't you wonder? Don't you remember Joanna?" At the mention of the name, a glitch seemed to ripple through them. Alex's left eye twitched violently. Tony's hand clenched into a fist, the knuckles turning white, then relaxed instantly. Joanna left, Tony recited. Joanna was ungrateful. Joanna is gone, Alex finished. It was a script. A pre-programmed response burned into their neural pathways. Amanda realized with a sinking heart that there was no reasoning with them. Whatever humanity they once possessed had been eroded, scrubbed away by years of Elizabeth's care and her special meals. She turned to leave, unable to bear the sight of their blank, bovine obedience any longer. "I'm going to my room," she muttered. She walked briskly down the hallway, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood. She needed to get away from the kitchen, away from the cellar door that hummed with a low-frequency vibration she could feel in her teeth. She turned the corner toward the main staircase and gasped. Tony was there. It was impossible. He had been behind her, standing like a statue by the cellar door. How had he moved so fast? How had he moved so silently? He stood in the middle of the narrow hallway, blocking her path. His sheer size eclipsed the light from the window behind him, casting a long, distorted shadow over Amanda. "Tony!" she squeaked. He didn't move aside. He took a step toward her. His movement was no longer jerky. It was fluid, predatory, yet possessed of that same terrible, mechanical inevitability. Amanda backed up until her shoulders hit the wall. She was trapped. Tony loomed over her. Up close, his face was a landscape of desolation. His skin was gray and waxy, the pores too large. But it was his eyes that terrified her the most. They were truly void of light. No reflection, no depth. Just flat, black discs of obsidian. He leaned down. The smell coming off him was overpowering, musk, sawdust, and underneath it all, the faint, sweet scent of barbecue sauce. His face was inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her cheek. It was cold. "Amanda," he rumbled. The sound vibrated in her chest. He didn't attack her. He didn't grab her. Instead, his expression shifted. For a split second, the mask of the automaton cracked. The unblinking gaze wavered. A flicker of something ancient and agonizing sparked in the black void of his eyes. It was a plea. It was a scream from a man buried alive inside his own body. He leaned closer, his lips brushing her ear. "Don't," he whispered. The word was a jagged shard of glass. "Don't what?" Amanda breathed, tears stinging her eyes. "Don't become delicious." The whisper was terrified. It was a warning delivered by a monster who knew exactly what he was. He pulled back. The spark in his eyes vanished as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the gray fog of his programming. His face smoothed out, returning to its rigid, impassive state. "Dinner is at 6, Tony stated flatly, his voice once again a robotic drone. He stepped aside, his movements jerky and synchronized with some invisible clock ticking inside his head. He gestured for her to pass, his hand stiff as a board. Amanda didn't wait. She bolted past him, scrambling up the stairs, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't look back, but if she had, she would have seen Tony standing there in the hallway, staring at his own hands that were large, strong, and utterly useless to stop the feast that was coming. He stood there, a hollow sentinel in a house of hunger, waiting for the dinner bell to ring. The warning from Tony, "Don't become delicious," hung in the air long after he had lumbered away, vibrating in the corridor like the aftermath of a bell strike. Amanda stood frozen on the landing, her breath hitching in a chest that felt too small for her heart. The house, which had previously felt like a grand, imposing fortress, now felt like a digestive tract, and she was slowly moving through it, being processed. She couldn't go back to her room. The sterile coldness of the bed she shared with William felt too much like a slab in a morgue. She needed answers. She needed to know what this house had consumed before her. Driven by a feverish compulsion, Amanda found herself climbing the narrow servants' stairs to the 3rd floor. This was the attic level, a space of slanted ceilings and dormant shadows, where the family dumped the things they didn't want to look at but couldn't bear to burn. The air up here was thick, tasting of rust and dried lavender. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light piercing through the dormer windows, swirling in a slow, suffocating waltz. Amanda pushed open the door to what looked like an old sewing room. It was a graveyard of textiles. Mannequins stood in the corners, draped in sheets like veiled widows. But her attention was drawn to a massive armoire against the far wall. It was made of dark walnut, its surface pockmarked by time, the varnish peeling away like dead skin. The handle was brass, green with corrosion. It felt gritty under her palm, the metal pitted and scarred. She pulled. The hinges screamed, a high, piercing shriek of metal grinding against metal, before the door swung open. Inside, the darkness smelled of cedar and something else. Something organic. Something sour. The shelves were stacked with bundles wrapped in yellowed muslin. They looked like mummies, or perhaps cuts of meat wrapped by a butcher from a century ago. Amanda reached for the top bundle. The fabric was brittle, disintegrating under her touch. As she unwrapped it, a cloud of fine dust puffed into her face. It was a blouse. White silk, or it had been white once. Now, it was a tapestry of decay. The fabric was stiff, crusted with large, irregular stains that had browned with age. It wasn't the stain of wine or coffee. It was the stiffness of protein, of lingering flesh that had liquefied and dried into the fibers. The silk was matted together in places, glued by this biological residue. Amanda felt bile rise in her throat. She forced herself to turn the collar over. There, embroidered in delicate blue thread that was now fraying and gray, was a name. Rebecca. She dropped the blouse as if it were burning. It hit the floor with a dull, dry thud. Rebecca. The name echoed in her mind. William had mentioned a Rebecca once, Tony's wife. She went back to her family in Oregon, he had said, his eyes fixed on his shoes. She didn't like the winters here. Amanda grabbed the next bundle. A skirt, heavy wool. The hem was caked with dried mud and something darker, something that had flaked off into a rusty powder at the bottom of the wrapping. Inside the waistband, Mary. Mary, Alex's first wife, or perhaps a sister. The history of the Blackwood women was a blur of departures. They all left. They all packed their bags in the middle of the night and vanished, leaving behind nothing but a quiet house and this. They didn't leave. Amanda looked at the pile of decaying fabric. These weren't clothes packed for a journey. These were the clothes of women who had been interrupted. The stain spoke of violence, or worse, of a slow, agonizing corrosion of the body while it was still wrapped in these garments. She stepped back, her heel crushing a mothball. A terrifying realization crystallized in her mind. She thought of Elizabeth. Elizabeth, with her skin like fresh cream. Elizabeth, who at 60 looked 35. Elizabeth, who grew more vibrant, more energetic, more beautiful every time the family grew smaller. The daughters-in-law weren't just leaving. They were being used up. They were batteries, drained of their youth and vitality to fuel the matriarch's unnatural longevity. You eat them, Amanda whispered to the empty attic. You eat them to stay young. The silence of the attic seemed to deepen, acknowledging the truth. Amanda fled the room, leaving the door ajar. The smell of the lingering flesh on the silk blouse seemed to cling to her hands, a phantom scent of rot that no soap would wash away. She needed proof, something more than old clothes, something concrete that William couldn't deny, that would shatter his hypnotic subservience. She ran down the stairs, bypassing the second floor, her feet carrying her inevitably toward the heart of the beast, the kitchen. The kitchen was empty. The stainless steel appliances gleamed with a clinical shine. But Amanda didn't stop there. She went to the pantry. The pantry was a narrow, windowless room lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves. It was Elizabeth's apothecary. Here, hundreds of jars were lined up with obsessive precision. Pickled vegetables, jams, preserves. But the air here was different. It smelled of vinegar, brine, and corrosion. Amanda scanned the shelves. Peaches, okra, beets, everything looked normal, yet terrifyingly suspended in time. Then she saw it. On the very back of the bottom shelf, hidden behind a large jar of sauerkraut, was a smaller mason jar. It was different from the others. The wax seal wasn't the cheerful red Elizabeth used for her jams. It was black, and the brine inside wasn't clear. It was murky, clouded with a swirl of orange-brown sediment. Amanda knelt. She reached back, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. She pulled the jar out. It was heavy. Inside, floating in the cloudy vinegar, were peppers. Small, red chili peppers that looked like severed tongues. But they weren't alone. Floating among the peppers were dark, metallic shards. Amanda brought the jar up to the light, filtering in from the kitchen. They were razor blades. Dozens of them. But they weren't shiny. They were eaten away by rust, their edges jagged and brown. The vinegar had accelerated the oxidation, turning the liquid into a bath of tetanus and lockjaw. And dancing between the rusted blades, suspended in the brine like grotesque confetti, were fingernails. Human fingernails. Torn, not cut. Some still had traces of nail polish. A chipped bright cherry red. Amanda gagged, her hand shaking so hard the contents of the jar rattled. Clink, 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 the sound of rust hitting glass. She rotated the jar. At the bottom, resting in a bed of sediment and pepper seeds, lay a ring. It was a simple gold band, tarnished but unmistakable. It had rolled to the side, pressing against the glass. Amanda squinted, her eyes watering from the sheer horror of the tableau. The engraving on the inside of the band was visible through the distortion of the glass and liquid. Alex and Joanna. The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't just a jar of pickles. This was a jar of suffering. Elizabeth hadn't just killed Joanna. She had preserved her pain. The razor blades, the torn fingernails, these were the instruments and the debris of torture. And by sealing them in vinegar, by keeping them in her pantry along with the food they ate, she was fermenting the agony. The rust on the blades wasn't just oxidation, it was the physical manifestation of the corrosion of a soul. Elizabeth believed that pain, like the peppers, needed to be cured to bring out its full flavor. "She's fermenting it," Amanda whimpered, clutching the jar to her chest, as if to shield the remains of Joanna from the cruelty of the light. "She's pickling the screams." The red nail polish on the floating keratin matched the shade Amanda had seen Joanna wear in the few photos that hadn't been burned. Amanda stood up, her knees weak. She had found the proof. Joanna hadn't run away. Her marriage, her identity, her very fight for survival, it was all right here, trapped in a glass jar, waiting to be used as a condiment for a meal Amanda was terrified she had already begun to eat. Suddenly, the floorboards above her creaked. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. Someone was walking in the kitchen. Amanda froze, the jar of horrors cold and slippery in her sweating hands. She was cornered in the pantry, surrounded by the preserved remains of a dynasty's victims, holding the wedding ring of a woman who was supposedly in California. The footsteps stopped right in front of the pantry door. A shadow fell across the threshold. "Amanda!" It was Elizabeth's voice, but it didn't sound like the porcelain mother anymore. It sounded like the rust in the jar, old, sharp, and toxic. "Are you looking for a snack, dear? You must be starving." The second Friday arrived not with the promise of the weekend, but with the inevitability of an execution. The sun had barely dipped below the tree line before the atmosphere in Blackwood Manor began to thicken, curdling into that familiar, suffocating density. Amanda had spent the week walking on eggshells, the jar of horrors from the pantry hidden deep beneath the floorboards of her closet. She hadn't confronted William. She hadn't screamed at Elizabeth. She had learned, quickly and brutally, that in a house of predators, the only survival strategy is camouflage. But tonight, she could not feign ignorance. Tonight, the hunger returned. At 6 p.m., the smell began. It was fainter this time, masked by a heavier, more pungent odor, the scent of burning herbs. White sage, copal resin, the same earthy, ancient smell she had encountered on the rooted hair in Joanna's room. It drifted through the vents, a sacred smog invading the domestic space. "I have a migraine, Elizabeth," Amanda had lied earlier, pressing a cold compress to her forehead. "I think I'll skip dinner and lie down." Elizabeth had looked at her, eyes shimmering with that terrifying, porcelain benevolence. "Rest, my child. The body must be purified before it can feast. I will bring a plate up to you later." Now, with the house locked down and the twins standing their silent vigil by the kitchen, Amanda moved. She didn't go down. She went sideways, The manor had an old service wing, a vestige of the 19th century that connected the main house to the original summer kitchen, a detached stone structure now used as the smokehouse. There was a crawl space above it, a maintenance access for the old ventilation systems that Amanda had spotted on the blueprints in William's library. She crawled through the dust and cobwebs, the wooden slats biting into her knees. The air up here was hot, rising from the room below. The sound of heavy breathing echoed through the ductwork, amplified by the metal, sounding less like a human and more like a bellows fanning a forge. Amanda reached the grate. It looked down directly into the smokehouse. She pressed her face to the cool metal grid, trying to see through the haze. The room below was bathed in a flickering orange glow. The industrial smoker in the corner was roaring, but the center of the room was dominated by a large butcher's block table. And there was Elizabeth. Amanda clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. The matriarch was not wearing her stiff Victorian collars or her pearls. She was wearing nothing. Elizabeth stood completely naked in the center of the room. Her body was a marvel of impossibility. At 60, her skin should have been slack, gravity taking its toll. But she was firm, muscular, and terrifyingly smooth. Her skin glowed with an oil she had anointed herself with, reflecting the firelight like a statue carved from living marble. She was beautiful, but it was a grotesque divinity. It was the beauty of an idol that demands blood to stay polished. The room was thick with smoke. Elizabeth held a bundle of burning sage in one hand and a chalice of copal in the other. She was moving. It wasn't a dance of joy. It was a sacrificial convulsion. Elizabeth jerked her body in a rhythmic, staccato tempo. Snap! Twist! Bow! Her movements were sharp, unnatural, as if her joints were being manipulated by invisible strings. She threw her head back, her long black hair whipping through the smoke like a dark halo. And she was chanting. The words that tore from her throat were not English. They were guttural, deep, and resonant, vibrating with a power that felt stolen. Uk'aba, Uk'igel Ubakel. It sounded like a corruption of something ancient, a twisted version of Mayan incantations, the language of Joanna's ancestors. Elizabeth was butchering the language, just as she had butchered the lineage, forcing the sacred syllables to serve her profane hunger. She was calling upon the gods of vitality, binding them to her will with the arrogance of a colonizer. Uxin! Uxin! Enter me! Enter me! The heavy breathing intensified. Elizabeth was hyperventilating, sucking in the copal smoke, intoxicating herself with the fumes of the ritual. Her eyes rolled back in her head, showing only the whites, creating a mask of blind ecstasy. She approached the butcher block. Lying there, waiting for her, was a slab of meat. It wasn't a generic cut of pork or beef. It was pale. It was long. It was covered in a layer of fat that glistened under the heat lamps. Elizabeth set down the incense. She reached out with her bare hands, caressing the meat with a tenderness that made Amanda's stomach heave. She stroked the skin. Yes, it still had skin, lovingly, like a mother stroking a child's cheek. "My sweet girl," Elizabeth cooed, her voice dropping from the guttural chant to a terrifyingly intimate whisper. "You were always so stubborn. But look at you now. So compliant. So ready." Elizabeth lifted the slab. It was heavy, dead weight. She held it up toward the light of the fire, inspecting it for imperfections. The light caught the surface of the skin. Amanda squinted through the grate, tears blurring her vision. On the pale, smooth skin of the meat, near what would have been the shoulder, was a mark. It was dark brown, distinct and jagged. A birthmark. A star-shaped birthmark. The world stopped. The heat in the crawl space vanished, replaced by a glacial void. Amanda knew that mark. She remembered the first time she met Joanna, months ago, before the disappearance. Joanna had been wearing a sleeveless dress in the garden. Amanda had complimented the unique shape of the birthmark on her left shoulder. "It's my constellation," Joanna had laughed. "My grandmother said the stars marked me for greatness." Now, that constellation was being prepped for the smoker. That wasn't meat. That was Joanna's arm, or part of her shoulder. The realization hit Amanda with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just looking at a murder victim. She was looking at a harvest. Elizabeth wasn't killing them and disposing of the bodies. She was consuming them. She was processing them. She was taking the stars of the Mayan lineage, the magic, the youth, the vitality inherent in Joanna's blood, and ingesting it to maintain her own monstrous immortality. Elizabeth brought the meat to her face. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, pressing her nose against the cold, dead skin. She kissed the birthmark. "Thank you for your donation," Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling with grotesque divinity. "You will live forever inside me. We will be one. You will never leave me." She laid the meat back down on the block. She picked up a long, gleaming knife. As the blade sliced into the skin, parting the star-shaped mark in two, a sound escaped Elizabeth's lips. It wasn't a grunt of effort. It was a moan of pleasure. High above, in the darkness of the crawl space, Amanda bit into her own knuckles until she tasted blood, desperate to keep the scream locked inside her throat. She had eaten this. Last week, she had eaten a piece of a woman she knew. She had let Elizabeth feed her this abomination, and her body had accepted it. The smoke from below drifted up through the grate, sage, copal, and the beginning sizzle of human fat hitting a hot pan. It wrapped around Amanda, marking her, choking her with the sacrificial reality of Blackwood Manor. The dinner bell would ring soon, and the main course was family. Sunday morning brought a stillness that felt like a held breath. The Blackwoods had left early for the family plot at the Whispering Pines Cemetery. Elizabeth claimed it was to pay respects to her late husband, but Amanda suspected it was merely a routine inspection of the graves where she buried the parts of the women she couldn't eat. The house was empty. The Sentinels, Tony and Alex, had driven the hearse black Lincoln Town car. William sat in the back, a pale ghost haunting his own life. Amanda stood before the heavy oak door of the root cellar. She held the key in her trembling hand, a heavy iron skeleton key she had swiped from Elizabeth's vanity while the matriarch was applying her morning face cream. The metal was cold, smelling faintly of the lavender lotion that masked the scent of butchery. She inserted the key. It turned with a heavy, oiled thunk. Amanda pulled the handle. The door swung open, exhaling a breath of air that was stale, damp, and carried the unmistakable smell of earth, not fresh garden soil, but the deep, wet clay of a grave that has been dug too deep. She flipped the switch on the wall. She expected flickering torches, or dim bulbs. She expected a dungeon of cobwebs and chains. Instead, the room flooded with harsh, buzzing fluorescent light. Amanda blinked, shielding her eyes against the clinical glare. It wasn't a cellar. It was an operating theater. The walls were lined with white subway tiles that gleamed under the lights. The floor was concrete, painted a glossy, industrial gray, sloping gently toward a large brass drain in the center. Stainless steel tables stood in varying sizes, scrubbed to a mirror finish. On the walls, surgical instruments, bone saws, scalpels, retractors, hung on magnetic strips, organized by size. It was clinical horror. There was no blood on the floor, no gore splattered on the walls. It was meticulously, terrifyingly clean. It was a space of efficiency, where life was dismantled with the precision of a Swiss watch. But the atmosphere was heavy. The air felt thick, pressing against Amanda's chest with the weight of absolute despair. It was the psychic residue of 1,000 silent screams that had bounced off these tiled walls, trapped forever in the grout. Amanda stepped inside, her sneakers squeaking loudly on the pristine floor. "Is anyone here?" she whispered. A sound came from the far corner of the room, behind a partition of heavy plastic curtains, the kind used in slaughterhouses to separate the kill floor from the freezer. Hooah! A wet, ragged intake of breath. Amanda walked toward the curtain. Her hand shook as she reached out and pushed the thick plastic strips aside. The sight that greeted her dropped her to her knees. In the center of the partition space, lying on a padded medical gurney, was a woman, or what was left of her. It was Joanna. Her face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, her eyes wide and staring at the ceiling. But her body, Amanda gagged, a violent spasm that nearly emptied her stomach. Joanna ended at the hips. Her legs were gone. The stumps were not raw wounds. They were healed over, the skin folded and scarred, looking like melted wax. Her left arm was missing below the elbow. The stump was wrapped in fresh gauze, slightly pink, as if the harvest had been recent. Joanna was a torso, a living, breathing torso. She was hooked up to an 4 drip that fed a clear, glowing liquid into her neck. But deeper than the needles, Amanda saw the magic. Around Joanna's chest, embedded directly into her skin, were intricate scars, symbols carved with a scalpel. They glowed with a faint, sickly purple light. These were the tethers, the soul tether. This was the reason Joanna wasn't dead. Elizabeth hadn't just amputated her limbs. She had bound Joanna's soul to her ruined body, forbidding it from fleeing to the afterlife. She was keeping the meat fresh by keeping the heart beating. Joanna was a living pantry. Joanna! Amanda choked out, crawling forward on the cold tiles. The woman's head snapped toward her. Her eyes were terrifying, wide, unblinking, filled with a mixture of madness and clarity that no human mind should be able to hold simultaneously. Amanda! Joanna croaked. Her voice was like sandpaper on stone. You look healthy. Oh God! Oh God! Amanda wept, reaching out but afraid to touch her. We have to get you out. I have to call the police. I have to— No police! Joanna hissed. A spasm of pain racked her diminished frame, but she didn't scream. She had forgotten how to scream. The police eat her skewers too. The sheriff, the judge, they all come on Christmas. Joanna shifted, trying to prop herself up on her one remaining elbow. Look at me, Amanda, she commanded. Look at what happens when you say no to Elizabeth. Why? Amanda sobbed. Why didn't she just kill you? Because dead meat rots, Joanna whispered, a grotesque smile stretching her cracked lips. She needs the vitality. She needs the fear. It adds flavor. It keeps her cheeks rosy. Joanna looked down at her missing legs, at the emptiness where her body used to be. I am the cornucopia, she murmured, delirious. I am the gift that keeps on giving. A thigh for Thanksgiving. A calf for Easter. And my arm was for your anniversary, wasn't it? Amanda recoiled, remembering the star-shaped birthmark on the meat in the smokehouse. She kept me alive with her dark arts, Joanna continued, her voice gaining a sudden, terrifying strength. But she made a mistake. She thinks she trapped me here. Joanna's eyes locked onto Amanda's. The madness receded for a moment, replaced by the sharp, cold steel of vengeance. She tethered my soul to this body, yes, but she forgot where my soul comes from. She forgot about the damp jungle and the old gods. Joanna nodded toward a metal tray on a nearby table. There is a bone, she whispered. My rib. She took it out last year to get to the tenderloin behind it. She kept it as a trophy. Hand it to me. Amanda stood up, her legs feeling like jelly. She walked to the table. Amidst the terrifyingly clean tools lay a single, curved bone, polished white. She picked it up. It felt heavy, vibrating with that same smell of earth and ancient power she had felt in the bedroom. She brought it to Joanna. Joanna grabbed it with her remaining hand. As her fingers closed around her own rib, the purple scars on her chest flared bright. She treats me like cattle, Joanna snarled, the clinical horror of the room fading as a raw, primal energy began to radiate from her shattered form. But she forgot, even cattle have horns. The fluorescent hum of the operating theater seemed to dampen, as if the very air was recoiling from the energy radiating off Joanna's broken form. Amanda knelt beside the gurney, her knees pressed against the cold tiles, entranced by the magical aura that was slowly filling the room, a heat that smelled of rainforests, stone pyramids, and copper blood. Joanna clutched the polished rib bone in her single hand. Her eyes, previously wide with madness, were now dark pools of ancestral heritage, ancient and terrifyingly calm. Turn off the light, Joanna commanded. Her voice was no longer a croak. It was resonant, echoing with the authority of a high priestess. Amanda scrambled to the wall switch and plunged the room into darkness. But it wasn't dark. The purple scars etched into Joanna's chest, the soul tether binding her spirit to this mutilated vessel, began to pulsate. And from beneath her skin, A deeper, redder light began to glow. It was the glow of molten rock, of blood that was remembering its origin. "You asked why she chose us," Joanna whispered in the dark. The red glow illuminated her gaunt face, casting shadows that looked like jaguar stripes across her cheeks. It wasn't random. Elizabeth is a collector, a parasite. Joanna shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at her healed stumps. "My grandmother was a curandera in the Yucatan," Joanna began, her gaze drifting to a place far beyond the sterile walls of the cellar. She healed with herbs and songs. She knew the names of the stars and the roots. "My blood, it carries that memory. It carries the primal power of the earth." She looked at Amanda. "And you have a pure heart, Amanda. A vessel of light. Elizabeth feeds on these things. She practices a twisted, bastardized version of the old consumption rituals. She believes that by eating the flesh of the gifted, she digests the gift." She said I was the final course," Amanda whispered, trembling. "She is a fool," Joanna spat. "She thinks magic is just calories. She thinks she can swallow a hurricane and just burp it up." Joanna raised her remaining hand. The rib bone she held was glowing now, absorbing the red light from her skin. "She has been eating me for 2 years, piece by piece," Joanna said, a savage grin spreading across her face. But she didn't realize what she was swallowing. "My blood isn't just nutrients. It is a Trojan horse. It is vengeance in liquid form. Every bite she took, every drop of my blood that is now circulating in her veins, it is waiting. It is a dormant volcano inside her body. I have been singing to it every night, Amanda. Singing the songs my grandmother taught me. Telling the blood to remember. Telling it to get angry." Joanna brought the rib bone to her mouth. With a grunt of effort, she used her teeth to gnaw at the end of it, sharpening the bone, activating it with her saliva. "She has woven herself into a trap of her own making," Joanna hissed. "She wanted my youth. She got my ancestors. She got the judgment of Zabalba." She thrust the bone toward Amanda. "Take it." Amanda reached out. Her fingers closed around the bone relic. A shockwave jolted through her arm. It wasn't electric. It was biological. She felt a surge of raw, untamed adrenaline. She heard the roar of a jaguar in her ears. She felt the heavy, humid weight of a jungle canopy pressing down on her shoulders. This was ancestral heritage condensed into a physical object. "This is the igniter," Joanna explained, her breathing shallow but steady. "It is my rib, a piece of the foundation. It is tuned to the frequency of my blood, the blood that is currently pumping through Elizabeth's heart." "What do I do with it?" Amanda asked, clutching the bone to her chest. It felt hot, alive, beating in sync with her own heart. "Tonight," Joanna whispered, "she will try to finish it. She will try to eat you to seal the cycle. You must be there. Do not run." Joanna leaned forward, her face inches from Amanda's. The red glow in her eyes was now a blazing inferno. "When she is at her peak, when she thinks she has won, throw this into the fire. Not just any fire. The fire that cooks the meat. The fire that transforms. And then, Joanna smiled, a look of pure, terrifying vengeance. You scream. You scream our names. You wake the blood. You ignite the primal power that she was too arrogant to fear." Suddenly, the heavy oak door at the top of the stairs creaked. The sound of heavy boots hit the landing. "They're coming," Joanna gasped. The red glow in her skin faded instantly, retreating deep into her marrow to hide. She slumped back onto the gurney, instantly transforming back into the broken, helpless victim. "Hide it," she hissed. "Go. Lock the door. Make them think I am just a broken toy." Amanda scrambled up, shoving the bone relic into the deep pocket of her jeans. She raced to the partition, slipping through just as the inner door to the cellar, the one she hadn't locked, began to turn. She hid in the shadows of a supply closet near the entrance, heart hammering against her ribs. Through the crack in the door, she saw Tony lumber into the room. He walked to the gurney. He didn't look at Joanna's face. He looked at her remaining arm. He squeezed her bicep, testing the muscle density like a butcher inspecting a side of beef. "Tomorrow," Tony grunted to the empty air. "Mother is hungry." Joanna didn't move. She lay still, eyes wide and vacant, playing her part perfectly. But Amanda knew the truth now. Beneath that skin, the blood was boiling. The trap was set, and Amanda held the match. The dining room had been transformed. The usual somber austerity was replaced by a spectacle of gluttony, so lavish it felt obscene. Hundreds of candles flickered in crystal holders, casting a golden, forgiving light over the sins of a table. The air was thick, not just with the smell of roasted meat, but with the heavy, cloying scent of expensive lilies, flowers used for weddings and funerals alike. The irony was suffocating. Amanda stood at the head of the table, her hands trembling by her sides. She hadn't been dragged here in chains. Elizabeth had simply waited for her at the top of the cellar stairs, smiling that perfect, porcelain smile, and invited her to dinner. "Sit, my darling," Elizabeth commanded from her throne-like chair at the opposite end. She looked radiant, her skin glowing with a vitality that seemed to suck the light right out of the room. "Tonight is the culmination, the grand finale." Amanda sank into her chair. Her pocket felt heavy with the weight of the bone relic, Joanna's rib. To her left sat William. If Amanda had held on to any shred of hope that her husband would save her, it evaporated the moment she looked at him. William was broken. He sat hunched over his plate, a napkin tucked into his collar like a bib. His eyes were red, swollen, and leaking silent tears that tracked through the grease on his chin. He was eating. He was putting a forkful of dark, fibrous meat into his mouth. He chewed with a mechanical, rhythmic desperation, swallowing his own betrayal along with the flesh of his sister-in-law. "I'm sorry," William whispered between bites, his voice wet and choked. "I'm so sorry, Amanda. But it stops the pain. If you eat, the fear goes away." "Look at him," Elizabeth cooed, slicing a piece of meat on her own plate. The knife slid through the visceral texture of the flesh with zero resistance. "He understands a sacrifice. He understands that family is about absorption. We take the best parts of those we love, and we keep them safe inside us." Elizabeth gestured to the platter in the center of the table. It was piled high with skewers, the harvest from the smokehouse. The meat glistened with fat, caramelized and charred in spots, looking horrifyingly appetizing. "And you, Amanda," Elizabeth said, pointing her knife at her. "You are the final course. The final course," Amanda repeated, her voice shaking. "The coup de grace," Elizabeth clarified, her eyes gleaming with a mania that was no longer hidden. "Rebecca gave me structure. Mary gave me skin. Joanna, oh, sweet Joanna gave me the fire in my blood. But you have a purity, a naive vitality that will seal the ritual. Once I consume you, the cycle is complete. I won't need to eat again for a generation." The gluttony in her eyes wasn't just for food, it was a hunger for existence itself. She wanted to devour time. "I won't eat," Amanda said, gripping the tablecloth. "Oh, but you will," Elizabeth smiled. "Because if you don't, I will have Tony and Alex bring William down to the cellar. And I will make you watch as I harvest him first." William let out a sob, dropping his fork. It clattered against the fine china, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Elizabeth stood up. She walked to the center platter and picked up a single skewer. It was the largest one, the meat dark and rich. She walked over to Amanda. The smell of the meat was overpowering. Smoke, sage, and the metallic tang of blood. "Open up," Elizabeth whispered, holding the skewer to Amanda's lips. "Partake of the communion. Become one with the family before you become the family." Amanda stared at the meat. She could see the grain of the muscle. She could see the char on the fat. It was a visceral nightmare. This was Joanna. This was the woman she had spoken to in the cellar just hours ago. But as the meat touched her lips, a vibration traveled through the floorboards. It was a low hum, like a generator coming online deep underground. "UK Abba, UK Aikel." The chant started as a whisper in the back of Amanda's skull. It wasn't a memory. It was a broadcast. Deep below, in the tiled sterility of the operating room, Joanna was singing. Elizabeth froze. Her eyes darted to the side. "What is that?" Then, the impossible happened. The meat on the skewer in Elizabeth's hand twitched. It wasn't a slip of the hand. The muscle fibers contracted. The meat throbbed. Amanda pulled back, gasping. On the table, the main platter erupted into motion. The mound of skewers began to pulse. Thump thump, thump thump. It beat like a living heart. The glaze on the meat rippled as the dead flesh remembered it was once alive. The visceral texture shifted from cooked food to living organism. William screamed, pushing his chair back, so hard it toppled over. He scrambled away from the table, wiping his mouth frantically, as if trying to claw the food out of his throat. "She's awake!" William shrieked. "The food is awake!" Elizabeth dropped the skewer. It hit the floor but didn't lie still. It writhed like a dying snake. "Impossible!" Elizabeth hissed, clutching her stomach. "She is bound. She is a stump. She is a Trojan horse," Amanda said, her voice finding strength in the chaos. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers closed around the bone relic. It was burning hot now, searing her skin. "And you just invited the enemy to dinner." The pulsing on the table grew violent. Plates rattled. Wine glasses shattered. The meat was resonating with a chant rising from the earth, a chorus of betrayal demanding restitution. Elizabeth doubled over, retching. But she wasn't sick. Her body was reacting to the foreign agent she had ingested. The blood of the Mayan healer was boiling inside her, rejecting the host. "Stop it!" Elizabeth roared at the ceiling, her porcelain face cracking into a mask of rage. "I am the matriarch. I am the mouth that eats." "Not anymore," Amanda whispered. She pulled the bone from her pocket. The dining room of Blackwood Manor was no longer a place of domestic order. It was a vortex of hysterical violence. The chandelier swung wildly overhead, casting shadows that lurched like drunkards across the peeling wallpaper. The table, once set for a queen, was now a chaotic landscape of shattered crystal and pulsing, writhing meat. Amanda stood before the roaring hearth, the heat blistering her skin. In her hand, the rib bone relic burned with a temperature that defied physics, vibrating with the collective rage of the murdered women. Elizabeth stood by the table, clutching her throat, her eyes bulging. She looked less like a matriarch and more like a vessel cracking under too much pressure. "Stop this!" Elizabeth shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical soprano. "I am the vessel. I am the keeper." "You are a graveyard," Amanda screamed back. She didn't hesitate. She hurled the bone relic into the center of the fireplace. The moment the bone hit the flames, sound vanished. For a split second, the world held its breath. Then the explosion. It wasn't an explosion of gunpowder or gas. It was a detonation of spirit. The fire in the hearth didn't just grow, it transmuted. The orange flames died instantly, replaced by a roaring, towering inferno of obsidian and cobalt blue, the colors of a bruised night sky, the colors of the deep Mayan cenotes. A shock wave of brutal heat blasted outward, knocking the wind out of Amanda. "No!" Elizabeth wailed, falling to her knees. The magic slammed into her. It didn't hit her from the outside. It detonated from within. Elizabeth's scream shifted from anger to echoing screams of pure, agonizing body horror. She clawed at her midsection. Her black silk dress, tailored to accentuate her unnaturally youthful figure, suddenly pulled tight. Rip! The sound of tearing fabric was sickeningly loud. Elizabeth's stomach began to move. It wasn't the subtle flutter of digestion. It was a violent, hydraulic expansion. Her abdomen distended grotesquely, inflating with a speed that snapped her ribs. Crack! 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 The sound of her own skeleton giving way under the pressure was audible over the roar of the blue fire. "Get them out!" Elizabeth gagged, blood spraying from her lips. "They're too big. They are too loud." Under the sheer, stretching skin of her stomach, shapes began to form. Horrifying, distinct shapes pushing outward against the membrane of her flesh. A hand, a knee, a face. Amanda watched in paralyzed horror as the distinct imprint of a human face pressed against Elizabeth's skin from the inside, mouth open in a silent scream. "Rebecca!" Amanda whispered. Then another shape pushed out from the side, tearing the oblique muscles. Another face. Mary! The spirits of the previous daughters-in-law were not just energy, They were re-manifesting. They were clawing their way out of the tomb Elizabeth had made of her own body. They were rejecting the absorption. Then came the sound from the hallway. SCHHH thump. SCHHH thump. It was a wet, dragging noise. The dining room doors blasted open. Joanna entered. She did not walk. She did not run. She crawled, dragging the ruin of her torso across the hardwood floor. But she was not alone. Ethereal, smoky tendrils, like the roots of a phantom tree, sprouted from her severed waist, gripping the floorboards, pulling her forward with terrifying speed. Joanna looked like a demon crawled out of hell's deepest pit. Her eyes were burning with blue fire that matched the hearth. Her hair floated around her face, suspended in an invisible current. "Mother," Joanna rasped, her voice layered with the growl of a jaguar. "You look full." Elizabeth looked up, her face a mask of sweaty terror. Her belly was now a distended, translucent sack of writhing souls, pulsing with blue light. "Joanna," Elizabeth whimpered. "Help me digest them." Joanna laughed. It was a brutal, jagged sound. "No," Joanna said. She raised her single hand, fingers splayed. "It is time for the final course." Joanna's eyes locked onto Elizabeth's. The connection was instant and violent. Amanda could practically see the invisible hook slam into Elizabeth's mind, seizing control of her motor functions. "Eat," Joanna commanded. Elizabeth went rigid. The look of agony on her face vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed, glassy stare. The thrall had taken hold. Elizabeth looked down at her hands. To Amanda, they were hands covered in blood and sweat. But to Elizabeth, hallucinating under the crushing weight of the Mayan blood curse, her hands had transformed. She didn't see fingers. She saw 5 perfectly grilled, succulent skewers. The skin was glazed with honey and soy. The meat was tender, falling off the bone. The aroma was intoxicating, overriding the smell of the burning house. Elizabeth's stomach, despite being torn apart from the inside by the rebelling spirits, roared with a sudden, supernatural hunger. The gluttony she had cultivated for decades turned inward, a black hole that needed to be filled. "Delicious!" Elizabeth slurred, saliva mixing with the blood on her chin. She lifted her right hand to her mouth. "Don't!" William shrieked from the corner, finally finding his voice. "Mother, don't!" Elizabeth didn't hear him. She only heard the dinner bell. She opened her mouth wide, unhinging her jaw like a snake. Crunch! The sound was wet and hard. Elizabeth bit down on her own thumb. Amanda turned away, retching, but the sound was inescapable. The body horror was absolute. Elizabeth wasn't just nibbling. She was eating with the voracity of a starving animal. She tore the thumb away from the joint, chewing frantically. Bone crunched between her molars. Gristle snapped. "So tender," Elizabeth mumbled, swallowing the chunk of her own flesh. "Best I've ever made." She didn't feel the pain. Or rather, she felt it, but her rewired brain interpreted the screaming nerves as an explosion of flavor. Tears of blood streamed down her cheeks, the physical body weeping while the mind rejoiced in the feast. She moved to the index finger. Snap! Tear! Chew! Blood poured from her mutilated hand, staining her silk dress, mixing with the blue light pulsing from her gut. "More!" Joanna commanded, her voice unrelenting. She dragged herself closer, watching the self-cannibalism with cold, hard eyes. "Don't waste a bite, Elizabeth. You always told us not to be wasteful." Elizabeth switched hands. She began to devour her left hand, starting with the pinky. She ate with a rhythmic, hysterical efficiency. The house began to groan. The walls cracked. The blue fire in the hearth spilled out, licking at the curtains, setting the rug ablaze. The very foundation of Blackwood Manor was rejecting the abomination occurring in the dining room. Tony and Alex, the hollow sentinels, were on their knees, clutching their heads, screaming silently as their connection to the matriarch fried their brains. They slumped over, lifeless, as the power source they relied on began to consume itself. "The flavor!" Elizabeth gasped, blood bubbling from her lips. She had eaten 3 fingers on her left hand now. "It tastes like forever." It tastes like the end, Joanna corrected. With a sickening squelch, the skin of Elizabeth's stomach finally gave way. It didn't explode outward. It dissolved. The spirits of Rebecca and Mary didn't walk out as ghosts. They poured out as pure, blinding energy, screaming, echoing screams of liberation that shattered the windows. They swirled around the room, a vortex of white light that mixed with the blue fire, creating a tornado of purification. Elizabeth, now handless and gutted, looked up at Amanda. For a second, the thrall broke. The hallucination faded. She saw her stumps. She saw her ruined body. The scream that left her throat was not human. It was the sound of a soul being dragged into the abyss. Bon appetit, Joanna whispered. The fire caught the tablecloth. The room was turning into an oven. Run, Amanda, Joanna said, not looking away from her mother-in-law. The kitchen is closed. The hallway was a tunnel of smoke and heat, the wallpaper curling like burning skin. Amanda ran, her lungs screaming for oxygen, her bare feet slipping on the polished wood that was now blistering under the intense temperature. Behind her, the dining room had become the epicenter of a supernatural supernova. The fire that consumed Blackwood Manor was not the chaotic orange of a grease fire. It was an obsidian flame shot through with veins of electric blue, a fire that didn't just burn matter but erased history. It roared with a sound that felt holy, a purifying chant rising from the earth to reclaim what had been stolen. Amanda crashed through the front door, stumbling down the stone steps just as the stained glass transom above the entrance exploded outward, showering the porch in a rain of colored shards. She didn't stop running until she hit the tree line. The damp earth of the forest floor felt cool against her burn soles. She collapsed against the trunk of an ancient oak, gasping, wiping soot and tears from her face. From the safety of the shadows, she watched the end of the dynasty. The manor groaned, a low, mournful sound like a dying leviathan. The support beams, eaten away by the smoldering intensity of Joanna's rage, finally gave way. Crash! The roof collapsed inward. The second floor pancaked onto the first. A plume of sparks and blue ash shot into the night sky, swirling like a galaxy of angry stars. In the center of the inferno, where the dining room once stood, the blue fire burned the hottest. It formed a pillar of light that seemed to connect the burning earth to the indifferent heavens. And in that pillar, Amanda saw them. The heat wavered, creating a mirage, but the figures were unmistakable. Standing amidst the roaring flames, untouched and serene, were three women. Joanna stood in the center, whole again. Her legs were strong, her arms complete. She wore a dress made of woven starlight. To her left stood Rebecca, tall and proud. To her right, Mary, gentle and smiling. They were holding hands. They were not screaming. They were not suffering. They were looking out toward the woods, directly at Amanda. Joanna nodded. It was a slow, deliberate gesture of release. A silent thank you. Behind them, deep in the core of the fire, there was no sign of Elizabeth. The matriarch, the devourer, the woman who wanted to live forever, had been utterly consumed. She was not a spirit. She was fuel. Her vanity, her hunger, her smoldering cruelty, it was all just ash now, feeding the liberation of her victims. The spirits began to fade, dissolving into sparks of white light that drifted upward, joining the smoke, finally free to leave the orbit of Blackwood Manor. With a final, thunderous crack, the main chimney collapsed. The vision vanished. The house was now just a heap of burning rubble, a pyre for a family that had eaten itself alive. A final silence descended over the clearing. The roar of the fire seemed to mute the world. No sirens wailed in the distance. The manor was too isolated, too forgotten. Amanda sat in the dirt, hugging her knees. She was alive. She was free. But as the wind shifted, blowing the smoke toward her, she gagged. It wasn't just the smell of burning wood. Underneath the scent of pine and ozone, there was a faint, lingering aroma. Sweet, savory, smoky. It was the smell of barbecue. The smell of slow-roasted meat, glazed with honey and spices. The smell of love prepared with a knife. Amanda buried her face in her hands and screamed. Her cry was lost in the crackle of the flames, swallowed by the forest. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she would never be clean. The silt would wash off, the burns would heal, but the memory of the flavor, the visceral, weeping taste of the meat she had swallowed, would remain on her tongue forever. Every time she walked past a restaurant, every time she smelled a grill in the summer, every time she saw a family gathered around a table, she would be back here. Back in the dining room with the porcelain monster and the pulsing platter. Amanda Blackwood stood up, her legs shaking. She turned her back on the smoldering ruins and walked into the darkness of the woods. She was the sole survivor, the one who got away. But as she walked, she couldn't stop herself from licking her lips, tasting the salt of her tears and the phantom sweetness of the most delicious, damnable meal she had ever eaten. The end